Good afternoon, everybody. We'll get started here, if you don't mind. Thanks so much for coming. My name is William Claspy. I'm the head of special collections here at the Kelvin Smith Library. I'm delighted to welcome all of you who are here in person for this event this afternoon, as well as those of you who are joining us on the live stream. And of course, for you time travelers in the future, seeing this on YouTube. In addition, I'd like to thank our co-sponsors for this event, the Department of English and the Writing Program. So big thanks to English Department Chair Walt Hunter and Writing Program Director Kimberly Emmons. This event is part of KSL's annual celebration of books and book collecting. This year, we're pleased to welcome our guest speaker, Rebecca Romney, or I should say, welcome back, Rebecca Romney. During the COVID pandemic, Rebecca gave an outstanding virtual presentation about book collecting for us, but it was all done remotely. So I'm glad we're able to have her here with us today in Cleveland on this beautiful spring day. We're taking advantage of the fact that 2025 marks the 250th anniversary of the birth of Jane Austen. Now, her birthday is not until December, but we're celebrating in April anyhow. The occasion has allowed us to put together an exhibit, which is on view now in our special collections reading room on the second floor of the library, of rare editions of books written by Jane Austen and by the authors who inspired her. If you haven't seen the exhibit, please take a moment after our event to go upstairs and see it. The idea for our exhibit was really inspired by the publication of Rebecca's new book, Jane Austen's Bookshelf, a rare book collector's quest to find the women writers who shaped a legend. So without further ado from me, let's welcome Rebecca and have her tell this story.
Hello, I am delighted to be here in person. I was supposed to be here in person before COVID, and then we had to adapt. And so I feel a little bit, as you say, it's like a return, a coming home, coming back. And this time around, I am going to be speaking on themes that hold hands with the lecture that I gave then. That was called Myth-Busting Book Collecting. And essentially the premise was anyone can be a book collector. It is not just those big headlines of a Declaration of Independence found in an attic or, the Shakespeare folios that sell for millions of dollars. You can also, like me, collect $15 Gothic romances. That's fine too, paperbacks. And that was a lot of how I focused that particular lecture, particularly based on my experience co-founding and administering a book collecting prize, the Honey and Wax Book Collecting Prize, which is an annual cash award of $1,000 for the best book collection put together by a young woman in the United States, aged 30 and younger. And so it was using examples from these young women's collections to show that there are many different ways to collect. And part of what I was doing in that lecture was speaking to what I had learned from those collections. I am by trade, by profession, I'm a rare book dealer. I co-founded a business called Type Punch Matrix that's based in Washington, D.C. And so I am a professional rare book dealer, professional bookseller. I also collect, though. I do both. I wear both hats. I tried very hard not to collect for a long time, and there was just a certain point in which I came across books that were just worth more to me than what I could sell them for. It was as simple as that. So I did start collecting, and that is part of what led me on a number of rabbit holes, one of which was this, Jane Austen's Bookshelf. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to tell you how the book got started, Jane Austen's Bookshelf. And that was with this book. It got started through my work as a rare book dealer. So I was on a house call, which for an antiquarian bookseller means I was going to look at someone's private library to see if we wanted to acquire any of those books for the shop. And there was a shelf of books that looked like this sort of dark emerald green cloth binding with elaborate gilt stamp design. I didn't even need to look at the titles. I just said, we'll take all those. So I bought these books for their covers. I didn't buy them for the text. And one of them was this book, Evelina, by Frances Burney. This is the 1903 edition illustrated by Hugh Thompson. It is part of a series called the Cranford series. That Cranford is a work by Elizabeth Gaskell. That was the first book that was reprinted in this 1880s, 1890s, and early 1900s series of beautiful reprints of classic books. So in 1903, this book, Evelina, was considered a classic worth reprinting in this beautiful dress. And I brought it back, and I'm trying to figure out how I want to catalog it. Because again, I bought it as a binding. I just thought I would put it into the context I just did for you, which was the Cranford series. It was turn of the century, Art Nouveau, all of that. Instead, I thought maybe I should just look a little bit more into who Frances Burney was. I had run across her name through a few other things. So she is mentioned in A. Edward Newton's Amenities of Book Collecting. So if you read books on book collecting, you have run into the story of Evelina. So I did know about it that way. But I was doing some internet searching. Very quickly, I learned that Frances Burney was one of Jane Austen's favorite novelists, favorite writers. And then I see a statement that says, Austen almost certainly took the phrase Pride and Prejudice from Burney's second book, Cecilia. And I went, wait, what? I love Jane Austen. I have read and reread her 6 completed novels. She died at age 41. She died so young. And I've often thought, if only she had lived longer to write more books. And here were these books that Austen was reading and using as her models that I hadn't known existed, let alone thought reading. So I took this moment, I thought, okay, I'm going to learn a little bit more about what Austen was reading, because if I can't read more Austen, I can read what she liked. And I go through this list. I'm just doing my Austen research, my new rabbit hole. And I see, okay, all of the men I have read. I've read Samuel Richardson, I've read Samuel Johnson, I've read Milton, I've read Cooper, I've read the men. And then there's a list of the women: Frances Burney, Anne Radcliffe, Charlotte Smith, Charlotte Lennox, Elizabeth Inchbald, Maria Edgeworth. I had read none of them, not a single one. And I thought, wait a minute, have I been being sexist? Have I just accidentally been missing? It was all the men and none of the women. It was that stark. So I had this moment where I thought, I need to do a correction in my own reading. I'm just going to start reading these novels and see if there's anything there. I've already read Richardson. That's fine. In terms of the history of the novel, you can't miss Richardson. But I had missed Frances Burney. And so I started with Evelina. Evelina is fascinating because it is so much the model for Austen. When Austen's father first tries to sell the book that becomes Pride and Prejudice on behalf of Jane Austen, he offers it to Frances Burney's publisher, and he uses as his market comp Evelina. He says, about the length of Miss Burney's Evelina. So right from the beginning, even Austen's family is using Burney as their comparable, as their model. And when I read Evelina, I had this moment where I realized this book wasn't forgotten because it isn't any good. That's kind of what we assume. If a book is not read anymore, if it's not part of the canon, it's because it's not good, because the canon is the books that are worth reading far after their time when they first come out. They're good for generations. They become universal, right? We still relate to them today. And I read Evelina, and I thought, I am relating to this. I do think this is fresh and interesting. I'm responding to this. So why was it not part of the canon as I understood it now? There has to be some other reason. So what happened was my question went from, are these books any good, to, yes, these books are good. So now why is it that we don't read them? And that's how the project for Jane Austen's bookshelf started. It was this combination of reader discovering these books for myself, ones that I had overlooked, and then my question from there of saying, how can I answer this bigger question of why we don't read them anymore if I like them so much. And that's where the book collector part came in. Because with book collecting, what you can do is you can trace these authors' reputations over time. You can see which publishers, how often a book like Evelina gets reprinted. Evelina was reprinted over and over and over again throughout the 19th century. You can compare, particularly Frances Burney, the last person I'm going to talk about, Maria Edgeworth, with Jane Austen in terms of the number of their reprints in the 19th century. And then that drops off in the 20th century. So you can trace this by book history. That's why collecting was a critical part of this rabbit hole. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a rundown of a number of the women whose works I investigated in the process of overcoming my own limitations here. And it's going to be kind of a whirlwind. I'm going to cover a lot of different women. But my goal here is not for you to remember every single person and say, this is the book, I'm interested in that, can I remember the difference between Charlotte Lennox and Charlotte Smith? No. If there's one thing that you take away today, I want it to be this. Perhaps like me, you assume that they were forgotten, these writers, because they weren't any good. And you're about to see how very wrong that is. So we will start with Frances Burney. I've already described Evelina a little bit. It was a bit of a surprise bestseller in that Burney published it anonymously. She didn't want to be known as the author, and then it did so well, she was essentially outed by her family. Austen adored Burney. Austen is very clear that Burney is writing some of the best novels then in existence. Austen has this description in her book Northanger Abbey where she sort of breaks form. You have a normal plot. You have your heroine, Catherine Morland. She's going about her life. She's annoyed by, the Thorpes, and she is, attracted to Henry Tilney. Fine, all the normal romance plot elements. And then, about 20 pages in, Austen suddenly breaks form, and she gets on this soapbox, and she talks in this extended defense about the genre of the novel. And she says, I don't know why we have to be so embarrassed about the idea that we read novels. Like, oh, what are you reading? Oh, it's only a novel. And how people have no problem saying, oh, yes, I was reading The Rambler. I was reading Samuel Johnson. I was reading Milton. That's fine to say, but if it's a novel, oh, it's only a novel. And Austen says, why do we do that? Why do we say that about novels? Why do we denigrate them that way? She says, they're only works in which the greatest powers of the mind are displayed, in which the most thorough knowledge of human nature, the happiest delineation of its varieties, the liveliest effusions of wit and humor are conveyed to the world in the best chosen language. That's Austen's defense of the novel. And then, in order to prove it, she names 3 novels. She names 2 by Frances Burney. She names Camilla and Cecilia. And she names another one by Maria Edgeworth, the woman I'll end on, Belinda. And so that actually provided a little bit of my bookends for my bookshelf, starting with Frances Burney and ending with Maria Edgeworth. This here is a copy of Camilla. And it has a great Austen connection, even aside from the fact that Austen loved this book. She references this book in her letters. She references the characters. She considers liking this novel a sign of someone that she could get along with, like a good friend. And this book, Camilla, was published by subscription, meaning that essentially it's like a modern crowdfunded project. People who wanted to support the author, they would pay more money up front in order to pay the costs of getting the novel published, and then as thanks, they got their names printed in the subscribers list, very much like a modern Kickstarter or something like that. And that's how we get Jane Austen's first appearance in print. Because this is the subscribers list, 1796, at the bottom there you see Miss J. Austen Steventon. Now, Austen's first book doesn't come out until 1811, Sense and Sensibility, and it's by a lady. It doesn't even have her name on it. It's anonymously published, just as, by the way, Burney's were. And you don't actually see Austen being named as the author of her books in print until the posthumous publication of Northanger Abbey and Persuasion. So this is 15 years before her first book, and in her lifetime, this is the mention in the book of one of her favorite authors. Camilla is, by the way, of Burney's novels, my personal favorite. I have to show you this really quickly because this is what you get when you're focusing on the book history side, when you are not just reading, but looking at books like they are historical artifacts. So this is a copy of Cecilia. That's Burney's second novel, mentioned in the Northanger Abbey passage. I knew I had to have a copy of this book for my Jane Austen bookshelf because this is the book that the Pride and Prejudice phrase probably comes from. The question was, which copy? Because that's the question a book collector asks. A reader might care about things like, oh, I prefer an audiobook or an ebook or a print book. But primarily, they want to access the text. They want to read it. Whereas a book collector is looking at that book as a piece of history, as evidence of its time and place in the lives it has lived since. The way I tend to describe the difference is that a reader is interested in the story in the book, and a collector is interested in the story of the book. So which copy of Cecilia did I want? I knew I wanted Cecilia. Which one? And I chose this one. I don't know if you can see it in the volume behind the one that's open. There's this sort of pink hue, these pinkish stains on the boards, on the leather. And those stains are explained by this annotation. So this book was owned in the 1780s by a woman named Bettina. We know that because she signed her name in it. And then she adds this little note. This is in volume 5. By accident, a strawberry fell onto the book, which has stained the leaves. So I just love the idea. And she's in volume 5, by the way. She has made it through the entire book, 5 of 5 books. And she's just sitting there, I don't know what she's doing, having a snack. She's just living life. Our reading is not separate from the rest of our lives. It's part of it. And so, this is practically 250 years ago. So to have that moment kind of quashed, for me, it's very much that moment of time travel, right? All right, let's move on to Anne Radcliffe. So, Anne Radcliffe, this is The Mysteries of Udolpho, first edition, and this is actually on display as well, the copy of the library. The Mysteries of Udolpho was a literary sensation, and this was one of the few books that I had heard of before I had started my Jane Austen bookshelf project, because it often gets name-checked in histories of the novel as like an important Gothic novel, which was a major trend at the end of the 18th century. It also happens to be the literary heart of Austen's book, Northanger Abbey. I have already referenced Northanger Abbey. I'm going to keep referencing it because it is, unpopular opinion, my favorite Austen book. It is a book about books. It is a book about loving books and reading and connecting with other readers. It's bookish culture, which was very much how Austen grew up. And Northanger Abbey is often described as a satire of Gothic novels because the basic premise is that the heroine, Catherine Morland, is going out on her own, essentially, or going out into the society for the first time, and she's young and inexperienced, and she loves reading these Gothic novels, and then when she has a chance to visit an old abbey to stay with her friend, she has all of these ideas that have been brought from the plots of her Gothic novels that she kind of imposes upon the situation there with her friend's family, which leads her to trouble. She's taking the books too literally. That is, the satire element is there. But the other thing about Northanger Abbey is that it's as much an homage to The Mysteries of Udolpho as it is a satire of it, because over and over again, the characters talk about how much they love this book. So there's a moment where Catherine Morland says, that's the heroine, she says, "While I have Udolpho to read, nothing could make me miserable." And the hero says, "When I had once begun it, I could not lay it down again. I remember finishing it in 2 days, my hair standing on end the whole time," because it was essentially a thriller. And I have to say, I experienced it very similarly. I had almost like a bodily reaction to it. I could not stop reading it, just like Henry Tilney. There was one moment where I was reading it and I was so involved reading it. I was trying to make coffee at the same time and I was pouring the water in and I didn't notice that I had poured the water into the wrong compartment, so it just started going everywhere and I did not see it. Like, that's how involved I was in reading this book. It did have that sort of spellbinding effect. And Radcliffe was famous for the spellbinding effect. In the 1790s, when she was publishing, her books were huge literary events. And when she published Mysteries of Udolpho, she was paid a record amount for a woman author. She was paid £500. The previous woman who had that record, by the way, was Frances Burney. And the publisher, Cadell, who was Frances Burney's publisher, when he heard how much Radcliffe was paid, the £500, he was so sure that it was an exaggeration that he bet £10 that it was an exaggeration, that it was wrong. He bet £10 against it. He lost that bet, And then he himself went to pay more for her next book, The Italian, because she was worth it. She was that good. Readers were reporting staying up all night, just like Tilney. Literary journals were literally printing odes inspired by it. There was one contemporary reviewer, who some believe was Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who called it the, quote, most interesting novel in the English language. She was, at the time, compared with Homer and Virgil and Milton. She was called the Shakespeare of romance writers. She didn't invent the Gothic novel, but she was the one who made it big. And so in terms of thinking about the big currents of the development of the novel in English, the Gothic novel was one of the first big trends, and Anne Radcliffe was at the head of that. And that's one of the reasons why Austen can use so much of Udolpho in Northanger Abbey, is she expects her audience to be familiar with the plot of Udolpho. She expects them all to have read it. She doesn't expect them to read her book. She expects them to have known Radcliffe. So I have to say, I mentioned a very bodily experience reading it. It's a thriller. I was edge of my seat, and it was one of my favorite reading experiences of this whole endeavor. But then, again, the question becomes, well, why aren't we reading this much anymore? I had this sense that The Mysteries of Udolpho was very melodramatic. You know, the heroine tends to faint a lot, right? And I'm a 21st century woman. Like that, the idea of fainting all the time, that's just not my thing. I still was so taken in by it. Even despite the things that didn't fit my aesthetic sense of taste anymore, I still saw what Radcliffe was doing and was completely on board. But what happens is, because she gets famous for these tropes that other people take on and perfect, there are authors who look back at her in the 19th century, authors including Charles Dickens, who look back at her books and treat them as manuals for how to write a page-turner, for example. Walter Scott as well, a number of major 19th century authors. She becomes so famous that she becomes kind of a concept in and of herself. She becomes the head of the Radcliffe school of doing Gothic novels. And so as Gothic novels become so trendy that they start to be kind of popularly derided, which happens very quickly, then she is the most heavily associated with them. It's a little bit like, when there's ever a big blockbuster, this happens even today, then you will see a slew of imitators. So, a big dystopian novel comes out, and then there are all these other YA dystopian novels. Like, that's how that works. And some of them are, in fact, still very good on their own terms. But that's the marketing, right, is that they find that there's a market for it, more things get published that way, you're feeding that existing demand, but then often it tends to be a glut, and then everyone gets sick of it. That's very much what happened with Gothics. And this book here is a good example of that. So this is a collection that was put together at the time. So there were 4 different imprints that were printed separately and then bound together. It's called a Sammelband. And they were Gothic chapbooks. So they're only 72 pages long each. And they were essentially pirated abridgments of more popular Gothics in most cases. So this book has 2 of the books in it, of the 4, are just piracies of 2 Radcliffe books, one of them being The Mysteries of Udolpho. So the title here, The Veiled Picture, is a reference to a very, very famous mystery in The Mysteries of Udolpho, what's behind the black veil. This is mentioned even in Northanger Abbey. And so this is a reference they expect everyone to get. It's, again, this Radcliffean trope. So you're using Radcliffe to sell your own chopped up, abridged, just mangled, destroyed works of literature that are clearly just commercially trying to take advantage of the moment. And so you can see how that would affect Radcliffe's reputation. So that was a lot of what I was seeing when I was looking at the book collecting side, next to the fact that, wow, I really enjoyed these books. How does that contradiction work? Okay, let's talk about Charlotte Lennox. Charlotte Lennox, personality-wise, I think was probably my favorite of all of the women that I researched for this book. She's very brash, she's very witty, she's very bold. The things that we tend to attribute to Austen these days of being witty, for example. Lennox is far wittier. I said it. It's true. And The Female Quixote is the good example of this. So The Female Quixote, published in 1752. That binding you can see here is not from 1752. I had a copy that I bought with a completely destroyed, deteriorated binding. I needed to get it rebound in order to protect the text block. And I thought, well, if I'm going to get it rebound, I should just take this opportunity and work with one of my favorite contemporary bookbinders. So I commissioned a special binding from one of my favorite bookbinders, Sol Ribora. And she created this, and it's just lovely. I don't know if you can see. It's got these raised sort of dots. It's a very tactile. Her bindings are things you really need to have in your hands. So I think people often think, oh, the art of bookbinding is dying or dead. And in fact, there are a lot of contemporary bookbinders doing incredible work. But back to the Female Quixote. So Female Quixote, you may guess, is based on the premise of Cervantes, of Don Quixote, except that the premise has been transposed into 18th century England. You have a woman who's growing up mostly in retirement, and her understanding of society is based on the books she reads, and so when she goes out into society, she starts making all these faux pas, thinking that society is going to be like the books she reads. And yes, you've already heard that plot summary, because that's how I described Northanger Abbey. That's what Austen did. She took the plot from Female Quixote and she essentially updated it for the popular novels of her era, which was the Gothic novels. So we know, too, that Austen read the Female Quixote and that she loved it. We have reference in her letters to her saying that as a family, they were reading a book and they didn't like it. So they set it down and they picked up the Female Quixote because they knew, after being disappointed with the other book, that they knew they would enjoy this. And Austen said it was equal to what I remembered it. It scratched that itch of the reread, very much like Austen's novels do for us today. So you can see that these parallels exist. And one of the things that I want to emphasize is I learned in the process of this project something that seems bad, but is not. I learned that Austen is, in fact, not all that original. And I think that originality is overrated. What's interesting is the dialogue between artists. There's nothing new under the sun. We're all taking these tropes and we're reworking them. We're applying them to our circumstances and adding our messages, what we want to focus on, different emphasis. How are we going to describe that? And that's what Austen's doing, is she's having a dialogue. Might she do things better or worse than other authors? Absolutely. Does originality need to be the virtue in and of itself? No, and in fact, I think it does a pretty big disservice to the fact that most artists are in conversation with the world around them. And that's very much what Austen was doing in her growing up in her literary family and being such a dedicated reader, and her family being such dedicated readers. One thing I want to talk about with Lennox very quickly is a good example of why I loved her so much and why I kind of related to her is a strong word, but found inspiration in her. Even, she's an 18th century author, and yet still her story felt very fresh and relevant to me today. The book that she published after Female Quixote was this one called Shakespeare Illustrated. It came out in 3 volumes, the first 2 in 1753 and then in 1754. This book was an iconoclastic tour de force. She essentially is criticizing Shakespeare. And in the 18th century, the idea that we have now of this iconic bard, Shakespeare being the canonical of the canonical, that was growing and really started to cohere into a movement in the 18th century with people like David Garrick, who's very prominently featured in the book, and Samuel Johnson, who I've already mentioned, and who is also prominently featured in the exhibition. And this cult of the bard is becoming a patriotic endeavor to show places like France that we have great writers too. So in that environment, it is really questionable criticizing Shakespeare. Why would you be doing that? Are you unpatriotic? And Lennox essentially comes in and she's just like, you know what? Shakespeare isn't perfect. And I'm going to show you how. And that is what upset people. So what Shakespeare Illustrated is, it's not actually illustrations in the way we think art. Illustrated here is referring to it's a critical work. It's looking at Shakespeare's texts and investigating them and analyzing them specifically in regard to their source material. So Shakespeare's plays in many cases were using plots from established stories from other sources. And what Charlotte Lennox does is she gathers those sources together, then in many cases she's translating them from French or Italian or whatever, and then once she has those portions, you can read them, and you have a sense, okay, this is what the original source looked like, and you have Shakespeare's play, let's compare and contrast. And when she does that, Shakespeare doesn't actually come off looking great. I think it's the Much Ado About Nothing. She describes that Shakespeare has mangled and defaced the story. The story comes from Ariosto's Orlando Furioso, which is a Renaissance epic from the 16th century. She has this line in it where she says, I just think it would just destroy any writer less great than Shakespeare. She says, quote, "He borrowed just enough to show his poverty of invention and added enough to prove his want of judgment." Yeah. So Samuel Johnson was delighted by this, by the way. He was a big supporter of Lennox, and he called her a bird of prey, Lennox. And he said, "Next, I will fly you at Milton." That never happened, though, because David Garrick and company got very mad at Lennox, and they kind of blackballed her, and she wasn't able to continue doing critical works like this. She turned to straightforward translation and continued publishing novels. But this is actually one of the reasons I like Lennox, was because when you're studying 18th century writing, and especially women's writing, you're often studying authors who have some type of financial fallback, that they don't need to make money from their writing. So, Frances Burney did have, or at least when she's beginning, in the Evelina era, she's not needing to make money. Anne Radcliffe's husband worked. A lot of the authors that I'm talking about, even Austen is an example of this. She did make money from her books, but she wasn't expecting to. And in fact, in many cases, early on, she wasn't counting on it. She was expecting to have to pay expenses herself. So they could do that, they could publish because it wasn't risky. Charlotte Lennox, it was risky because she was essentially de facto orphaned as a teenager. She had this terrible situation where her father was in the military and her parents were in colonial America and colonial New York. And they can't really afford to raise her, so they send her back to England on a boat. And when she arrives, the aunt that she's supposed to stay with dies. And so her parents are in colonial America, and now she, as a teenager, is in England being like, well, what do I do now? And she spends her entire life. She is one of the people who actually has to work to make a living. And the thing that I love about Lennox is that she is so bold. She is still saying, I need this book to sell, and I am still going to be myself. I'm still going to criticize Shakespeare if I think he deserves it. And I found that balance between practicality and being true to oneself a very inspiring thing, and something that even today, as a business owner, as a writer, that I was really responded to. Elizabeth Inchbald is one of the other great examples of a woman who was self-made, essentially. She was an unschooled farmer's daughter, and she, at age 18, ran off to join a theater troupe. She left home, she ran away to London, and she wanted to be an actress. And she worked as an actress for a while, and then she became a playwright, and she also became a celebrated novelist. She became, in the last few decades of her life, she was known as the celebrated Mrs. Inchbald. She was considered one of the most important English writers of the years that she was active, from the 1780s until the 1810s. And her biographer, James Bowden here, calls her, quote, the cleverest self-educated woman that ever lived. A little bit of hyperbole there, perhaps, but she is amazing. I also really love this portrait of her. I don't know how clearly you can see it, but it's very penetrating, and she's got a book in her hands. I love it. So Elizabeth Inchbald, playwright and novelist, she really first made a name for herself as a playwright. She was so famous in the 1810s that when there was a canonical series of theater reprints, reprints of plays called The British Theatre, the publishers asked Elizabeth Inchbald to put her name on it. So very much like when we see a famous director, like Guillermo del Toro presents, that type of thing. That is what they had Elizabeth Inchbald do for the British Theatre. Her name was a huge part of what they were looking to sell, this British Theatre canonical anthology. So she is this huge deal, much bigger deal than Jane Austen ever was in her lifetime. Yet today we remember her primarily as the author of a single play, because that play features prominently in Austen's book Mansfield Park. So Mansfield Park, of course, the plot is you have the patriarch of the family who is going off to look at his Caribbean estates, and while he is gone, all of the young people are, getting in trouble, essentially, and they put on a private play, which was a thing that was done at the time very much, but which play you put on was questionable. So some plays were considered modest and fine, and other plays were considered not so modest and fine. And Lover's Vows was questionable. And so that becomes one of the things that drives the plot in Mansfield Park. And the thing that's so frustrating about this for me, having now read a number of Inchbald's plays and novels, she's a comedic writer, so her plays are comedies. She is very funny. She is the only writer, when I was going through this project, who I really wanted to just stop and post lines on social media from her writings. Like, she just had mic drop moments all the time. And you can see that because as an actress, she has to have a sense of comedic timing, right? She experiences that as the actress. She knows immediately how audiences are responding. She knows what gets audiences to laugh and not. And so as a playwright, she's bringing all that experience as an actress to say, what is going to get that reaction? What will make people laugh? And even today, it still works. And by the way, a lot of these plays are quite short. You can pull them up online right now. Not right now, maybe. Wait 20 minutes. And read them in an hour or two. And a number of her plays, that's how I read them. And so it's a little frustrating that the play we remember her for is the one called Lover's Vows. First, Lover's Vows was an adaptation from a German play, and so it wasn't her original plot. It was an adaptation, which is to say a lot of the lines in there, and specifically a lot of the funny jokes, were absolutely Elizabeth Inchbald's invention. You can compare the text side by side, the German and English, and see. So it is still Inchbald, but it is... It's a very moral play, actually, hilariously. It's very stilted, and part of it is the thing that raises eyebrows for everyone in Mansfield Park is the relationship between the young woman and her tutor that she's in love with, and how she's very blunt to her tutor. And so that's those lines of a young woman delivering those lines is part of the problem in Mansfield Park. But in fact, I found that play not very fun and exciting at all, and it was other plays of hers that I found very funny. So that's the thing that's very frustrating to me, is that I'll Tell You What, far, far superior. You should read I'll Tell You What. I'll Tell You What, by the way, is a comedy about the aftermath of an affair. And again, I think we think back, we think the 19th century, we think about Austen's publishing in the 1810s. She's a Regency author in terms of publishing, and a lot of her reading, and technically the Regency is part of this, she's a Georgian era writer. The Georgian era is not nearly as buttoned up as the Victorian era. So the Victorian era we tend to think is very kind of prudish and doesn't talk about sex. That is not the case in the 18th century. So yes, you could in fact have a play about an affair, about a wife cheating on her husband, and it would be a comedy. Appearances Against Them is what we call a farce, which is to say it's kind of a short comedy. It's 2 acts instead of 5. Also very funny. It's about a scarf that gets lost, and everyone at one point or another is accused of stealing it. It's kind of like Game of Clue. These, by the way, I'm collecting these. These are first editions, the first printings of these plays once they reached print form. You can see when they're first performed at Haymarket, at Covent Garden. These were like $35 each. These were not expensive. 18th century plays. One thing to keep in mind about book collecting is that the marketplace for book collecting is like any other marketplace. It's about supply and demand. How many copies survive and are available for acquisition, and how much do people want it? And I guess I'm the only one who wants Elizabeth Inchbald plays, because $35 each I thought was a steal. Price of lunch, price of dinner with a friend. I am absolutely adding that to my collection. So part of what you can do, if you're like me and you say, oh, I really love Jane Austen, but I can't afford, the 6 figures to get a first edition of Pride and Prejudice, or 5 figures to buy a first edition of one of her other works, or even the famous Peacock edition of Pride and Prejudice from 1894, that's like a $5,000 book at this point. There are other ways that you can collect relating to Austen and Austen's world that aren't that at all. What happens is if you have any types of barriers, whether it's because of money, or maybe it's even space. You can't create a whole library, and you can see these are very slender. You can put these all in a box, right? All of those restrictions, as you see them, those are not, in fact, walls. Those are opportunities to be creative, and that's where it really gets fun. So let's move on to Charlotte Smith. I think I've heavily weighed in my survey of course, the ones I like the most, the ones who really had to work for it. Charlotte Smith. This is one volume from her first novel, Emmeline. Emmeline was read by Austen as a teenager. Young teenage Austen loved Charlotte Smith's novels. Her characters are referencing Charlotte Smith's novels very lavishly. One character in her juvenile novel that she worked on when she was about 15 or so, called Catherine of the Bower. One character says, "Oh, I'm quite delighted with them," Mrs. Smith's novels. "They're the sweetest things in the world." And she said she prefers Emmeline over any of the others. And Charlotte Smith often gets a little overlooked in terms of her influence on Austen in favor of, say, Frances Burney, as we've already talked about, and a few of the others we'll get to, like Edgeworth. But there's been a lot of recent scholarship by, say, Jacqueline Labrie, who focused on how Charlotte Smith's novels have affected Austen's novels. And this is quite obvious if you actually take the time to read Charlotte Smith's novels. I want to talk a little bit more about that, but before I do, I have to kind of swing a little bit into Charlotte Smith's personal history. This is a copy of Elegiac Sonnets. Elegiac Sonnets this is a deluxe edition that comes out later, but the first edition was her first publication because Charlotte Smith first started publishing out of duress. When Charlotte Smith was 15, she was raised in a very high-class aristocratic family, very wealthy family. At age 15, she was married off to another teenager, Benjamin Smith, who was also from a wealthy family, and it was an economic arrangement. Everyone was happy, all the families were happy, and Charlotte Smith, in retrospect, described it as being sold like a South Down sheep. Benjamin Smith was not a good match for her. He was not a very serious man. He was constantly coming up with schemes. He immediately starts cheating on her, of course. He was, in fact, physically abusive, and he spent so lavishly and way beyond even their wealthy means that by the time that she has had 11 children, he actually has spent all of their money, their available money anyway, their wealth. He has spent it all, and he gets thrown in debtor's prison, which, yes, is a thing that can happen in the 18th century. So you can be thrown in jail for debt. And so when he's in debt, and Charlotte Smith has had her 11th child, and by the way, she gets pregnant with her 12th. Wow, he's in debtor's prison. Anyway, so she is like, I need to figure out some way to get money. But she's raised as this aristocratic woman. She's not raised to trade. She doesn't know how to make money. And so she thinks, okay, I have always loved composing poetry. I have poems. I could turn them into a book, and maybe that will provide some funding in order to get my husband out of prison. She goes to a publisher. The publisher initially says, yeah, poems don't sell. And specifically the type of poems that she was writing, which were these bucolic sonnets. He's like, these are not in anymore. No one's interested in these. And so she pulls a few strings. She gets a friend of hers who has kind of a big name to say, no, these are great. And the publisher says, fine, I'll publish them. And it turns out to be a landmark in the history of poetry because Elegiac Sonnets is considered the publication that revives the English sonnet. Right. So you have in the 17th century people like Milton who are writing the sonnet, right? And then you do get the Romantic poets who were writing sonnets. But before that, in the 18th century, in the early 18th century, the Augustan age, you have people like Alexander Pope. They're not writing sonnets. Sonnets are out, just like that publisher said. Those are not cool anymore. That's not what we do. And Charlotte Smith is credited, and this is not, by the way, in retrospect. This is contemporary accounts who are crediting her as the person who revived the English sonnet. It is a huge moment. She is the one who sets the terms and sets the stage for people like Wordsworth and Coleridge, who are both very specifically and vocally indebted to her. In fact, Wordsworth has a line, something along that. He says, English poetry owes more to Charlotte Smith than it will ever know, certainly not nearly as much as she deserves, kind of thing. And Coleridge did an entire pamphlet about Smith and another sonneteer about how they revived it. So this book here is the deluxe edition. This is the 5th edition overall. It's the first illustrated edition. And the reason it's deluxe is because just like Camilla, the Frances Burney book that had Austen's first name in print, this was printed by subscription. And the idea with subscription, as I mentioned, is people would pay upfront. And what happened was when you did that, when you shifted the risk of the publication coming into being to the author rather than the publisher, what that meant was that if it did well, the author took home more of the money. The idea in a normal publication, normal trade publication, is that the publisher says, well, I'm taking on all the risk. If it doesn't sell, I'm the one who's trouble, so I'm not going to pay the author very much, right? But if the author's like, well, I'm paying for everything up front. If it doesn't sell and I get nothing, that's on me. But if it does sell, I take home more. So the subscription edition was the edition of the elegiac sonnets that brought Charlotte Smith the most money. And this was really meaningful to me because what Charlotte Smith did is after the success of the first edition of elegiac sonnets, she started thinking about a career as a writer. And she uses her career as a writer to leave her husband. She and her 12 children, who all go with her, by the way. He doesn't provide any financial support, just to be clear. They all go with her. She supports her children through her writing. And as I said, the elegiac sonnets makes her the most money for a single book, or for a single book of poetry. But novels made her money by the volume. She would get, say, like £50 per volume. So if she published a 4-volume work or a 5-volume work, she would make £200, £250, which was generally more than what you'd make doing poetry. So Charlotte Smith started writing novels for the money. And I consider it something that she used those writings in order to write herself free. That's what she was doing. And you see how this actually makes it into her novels. And this is why she's so fascinating to read even in the 21st century, is because unlike the reputation that even she kind of has for some critics, but that certainly the genre, the romance novel, has as a whole, that it's just some, love story, no one's serious there, and it's all just like moony eyes and, heroes who are unbelievable and everyone's perfect and blah, blah, blah. That is not the way Charlotte Smith writes, in fact. One of the main themes you see in her romance novels is do not get married because the guy who's courting you is rich. She had personally experienced that does not work out for you. She says you need a relationship of mutual affection so you know that he's not going to turn on you. And you should wait until you're older to get married. You shouldn't just marry the first rich guy who comes your way. That's what you see thematically in her novels over and over and over again. And so when you think about romance novels from that perspective, that who you marry is a critical decision for a woman's entire life, literally her legal existence. In the 18th century, a woman's legal existence gets subsumed under her husband. She stops being a political, legal entity when she gets married. So that is an incredible amount of power to give to your husband. Charlotte Smith says, be careful who you marry. And that is almost the exact opposite reputation that romance novels, that these courtship novels get in this era. And it's very much the type of dialogue that Austen is having in her novels, if you're reading them. You can read them for the romance. You can enjoy, Keira Knightley, and you can enjoy Darcy, and you enjoy the hand flex, and that's all good. And also, that economic question, the question of stability, the question of survival, is built into Austen's books, and it's built into the novels that she's reading in this courtship novel tradition. And then I'm going to end on Maria Edgeworth. Maria Edgeworth was the person I mentioned as the bookend. So Belinda, her novel Belinda, was mentioned by Austen in Northanger Abbey as one of the best novels, but best instances of the novel. And in fact, during the period when Austen is essentially attempting to get published, the early 1800s, Maria Edgeworth is essentially the most popular and respected novelist. You kind of have the 1790s, you have people like Burney and Radcliffe in the 1790s, and then from about 1800 to 1814, Maria Edgeworth is the one that the critics love, is the one when her new books come out, everyone is talking about them. 1814 is the limit there because it's not an Austen novel that gets published, then it's Walter Scott's Waverley, and he becomes the big author after that point, big novelist rather. And when he publishes Waverley anonymously, he ends it with a note that includes a homage to Edgeworth. He says, I'm trying to do in these books for Scotland what Maria Edgeworth did for Ireland. So she's a model for Walter Scott as well. And so one thing, you've heard me mention this here and there throughout this lecture, but one thing I want to drive home is that every single one of the authors I've talked about today was, by pretty much any measure, a more successful novelist than Austen in her lifetime. Austen looked to them as models. There are these moments, like I mentioned Belinda, or Evelina at the beginning. There's this scene in Pride and Prejudice that matches something in Evelina. So Pride and Prejudice has that famous scene at the beginning where there's a ball, and Elizabeth Bennet overhears Darcy say something rude about her, and it starts the tension between the two of them, that sort of enemies to lovers, love-hate relationship. And it's a very famous scene, and if you described that scene to someone of Austen's time, they would say, oh, you mean like that scene in Evelina? Because there's a scene in Evelina that fits that same dynamic. And so what Austen was doing here is that, yes, she was giving her own versions of these, but she was writing in a context. She wasn't writing in a vacuum. Maria Edgeworth is the perfect example of that. She talks about when she's writing to one of her nieces had ambitions to be a novelist too, and Austen kind of jokes and says, well, I have made up my mind to like no novels really except Miss Edgeworth's, yours, and my own, which is to say, we're joking that I only like family, and of course Maria Edgeworth, because she's the exception to everything. I'm going to end my comment on Maria Edgeworth very briefly just to say I have to quote something. I mentioned Walter Scott. So Walter Scott and Maria Edgeworth become friends after Walter Scott's Waverley comes out, and for a while they're correspondents, but then when Maria Edgeworth is 55, she visits Walter Scott in Edinburgh. And Scott was delighted by this. He called her the old lion. And Scott's son-in-law was a big recorder of Walter Scott's life. He ends up writing a very famous biography of Walter Scott, and he describes Maria Edgeworth during this visit. And this is how he describes her, quote, a little, dark, bearded, sharp, withered, active, laughing, talking, impudent, fearless, outspoken, honest, Whiggish, unchristian, good-tempered, kindly ultra-Irish body. I like her one day and damn her to perdition the next. And I just feel like, if there's any phrase calculated to make me love a woman, I think that might be it. Wouldn't you want to have dinner with her? I'm sorry, I would. So here, just to end, these are a couple editions of Maria Edgeworth published in the 1890s. I show them because they are going to look very familiar in design to, if you know a lot of the 1890s publications of Jane Austen, Maria Edgeworth being published right next to Austen in the 1890s. These are gorgeous. Maria Edgeworth was incredibly popularly reprinted throughout the 19th century. So we're out of time. I'm only going to say, if you like Austen, definitely read Belinda or Helen. Helen was published in 1830, I believe, and it is a much later novel for Edgeworth, but in terms of the traditional sort of courtship novel like Austen's reading, definitely read Helen. It's very, very good. My personal favorite is a novella called Ennui that I read in a single afternoon, like a gulp. I think that pound for pound, we have Pride and Prejudice, which we love. Pride and Prejudice, perfect book, right? Perfect book. Too Many Bennet Sisters, otherwise perfect book. Let's leave aside Pride and Prejudice. Pound for pound, Maria Edgeworth novels match, in my opinion, the quality of any of Austen's novels. It's true, I said it. So if you're interested in reading more like Jane Austen, Maria Edgeworth or Frances Burney should be your first stop. But I do just want to reiterate from that despite our cultural admiration for the lone genius, no writer, in fact, works in a vacuum. And Austen has been called the first great woman writer in English. That was a famous biography of her in the 80s. But Austen never viewed herself as the one great woman writer of her era, and she wasn't. Thank you. I think we're going to take some questions here. Bill's got the microphone, so if you have a question, you can raise your hand and the microphone will come up to you. There we go.
Have you been to the Chawton House Library that Sandy Lerner started?
Yes. So the question is, has I been to the Chawton House and specifically the library? Yes. The answer is yes, of course. It was definitely part of my own Austin pilgrimage time, and it was very satisfying to see on the shelves the different titles, to see so many Radcliffe's novels, for example. To me, I talk a little bit about Chawton House in the book, but one of the things that I would have loved to have an extra chapter on that I did not is talking about the contributions specifically of book collectors like Sandy Lerner in these preservation activities, and how a lot of the things that we have today and those heritage-based things, they're not only institutions who are doing that. Those are collaborations often with visionary private collectors.
Any other questions? In the back.
Hi, I had missed the first 10 minutes, so I don't know if you said this or not. But where do you, I guess, find your rare books? Where do you buy them?
No, that's a great question. I did not address that. I have, an unusual advantage because I'm a professional rare book dealer. But people ask me that question as a professional rare book dealer too. They say, where do you find it? Because my job, about a third of my job is just in hunting, just in looking for the books. They are called rare for a reason. And I can't just place an order. I'm designing a T-shirt, and I have a factory I work with, and I say, I want 500 more T-shirts. I don't get to do that. I don't get to place orders and just have them magically appeared. I have to find them. So the short answer is anywhere I can. And that can be any number of places. I monitor auctions. I sometimes monitor estate sales. Sometimes a dealer in Ohio will come across a collection of romance novels, and they don't know a lot about romance novels, so they'll call me. Our world is very collegial like that. We work together. What else? Private collections are the main way I like to get them. So I started the talk talking about a copy of Frances Burney's Evelina that I bought on what I called a house call, which was going to a private collector's house and looking at their library and making an offer on their books. By far, my favorite way to acquire rare books is from private collectors who've built their own collections over many years.
I kind of have the flip side of that question, because you mentioned when doing these rare books, you're focusing on the binding and the covers and whatnot. But when you were reading them for the actual text, what's your preferred method? Do they still publish these as mass market paperbacks? Are you just Project Gutenberging everything?
That's a great question. So the question is essentially how are you reading these? Are you reading them as rare books? Are you reading them in some other format? And for this project, I read every which way. There were some occasions, as I said, with Elizabeth Inchbald, I literally just pulled it up on my laptop. There were other occasions. I mentioned reading Ennui, that Mariah Edgeworth book, in 4 hours. I read that in a second edition copy that's in this beautiful Spanish calf binding. It's gorgeous, and you look at it and you say that looks like a rare book, but I read it just like a book I was reading. You can in fact do that. There are just essentially, books were engineered to be handled. They were engineered to be in our hands. So as long as you're not really straining the binding, etc., as long as you're handling them with clean, dry hands, you're generally fine to handle about 99% of these books. And so you can, in fact, read them. And I would, on occasion, read the actual books I was collecting. In other cases, for Burney in particular, I was reading these really hilariously thick paperbacks, because Burney's novels, they're like 5 volumes. And so they go out like this, and you get all these spine creases on the paperbacks as you go through them. There was one reprint series, this Mothers of the Novel series, that came out in the 80s based on Dale Spender's book. And I collected all of those reprints. And because I was collecting them, in some cases, when I said, I wanted to read that, I would read that copy because I had it at hand. So truly, every which way, whatever I was feeling on the moment. Sometimes, Evelina, I started by reading on my phone. It really just depended. I was very capricious about it, honestly. And I talk about that in the book because I want people to get out of the idea that there is a right way to read, that it's okay to read it on your laptop. It's okay to read the 1809 second edition as well.
So I haven't read any of these antecedents to Jane Austen, but I find her very distinctive. And I'm wondering how you view her, why she's lasted the way she has, and people are just nuts about her in this country. Did that happen to all these other women, or is there something special about her?
So you were describing the book. I try to answer that question chapter by chapter, author by author in the book about why we don't read them the way that we read Austen. Austen had a few things going for her, and this is one good example is compare and contrast with Anne Radcliffe. So Austen, as I said, Austen in her lifetime, she did well as an author, but she was nowhere near the success of the authors I've been talking about. And then after the posthumous publication, right after she dies, of her final completed novels, Northanger Abbey and Persuasion, there's this sort of lull. And then in the 1830s, the family contracts with Richard Bentley in order to put out Austen's books again in the standard novels series. And there's a tendency to be like, look, that's when she became canonical. And I'm like, sure, but Elizabeth Inchbald was in that too, and so was Frances Burney, and so was, like most of the writers I'm talking about, Charlotte Smith, were in those series, and they're not canonical anymore, so it's not that simple. But moving forward, Austen was regularly reprinted and regularly read in the 19th century, not as regularly reprinted as Maria Edgeworth. In 1870, a biography of Austen comes out, a book-length biography, Memoir of Jane Austen by her nephew, James Edward Austen Lee, who was 18 when Austen died. And this biography hits at exactly the right time in terms of aesthetic taste in literature. So when Austen was writing in the 18 teens, publishing rather, in the 18 teens, one of the first extended critical assessments of her is done by Walter Scott on the occasion of Emma coming out. And what he emphasizes is her realistic characters, like, oh, we all know someone like Lizzie Bennet's father. And the realism of her characters is what's interesting. But a common criticism was just that it was too everyday, it was too ordinary, and that novels should be high art and they should be reaching for something more, like Shakespeare's tragedies, like this is extreme, Paradise Lost, right? These are big stakes, like that's high art. And she was essentially focusing so much on the ordinary that it didn't feel like it had that transcendence that a lot of the other novelists that were more acclaimed had. So that was the criticism at the time. That's what critics were saying. And then when the memoir comes out in 1870, this is the era when ordinary realism is becoming the thing. You have people like William Dean Howells in the United States, who is all about the realism of the ordinary, and he becomes an Austen superfan, and he's writing about her in magazines, and he's trying to, he is constantly pushing her on Mark Twain, and Mark Twain's so annoyed by it, he starts saying really mean things about Austen, pretty much just to upset William Dean Howells, his friend. Anyway, so what happens is it comes out at just the right time when a reassessment fits the taste of that generation, and it gives her new life, and it occasions not only that new critical reappraisal, but essentially the first wave of popular fandom. Soon after that, you get the publication. It's 1894, so not soon after. That's 25 years. We tend to compress history retrospectively. But after that, you get the name Janeite starting being used, right? So you start seeing actual fandom. That tipping point, that was a turning point for Austen, the publication of that memoir. Around that same time, the poet Christina Rossetti was a super fan of Anne Radcliffe, and she said, I want to write a biography of Anne Radcliffe. I think she is so important, and I think she deserves a biography, and I want more people of this new generation to read her. Anne Radcliffe was an incredibly private person. She retired early from her career from public eye. She wanted to be left alone. And so when she died, there was not much material related to her. There was a small biography that was added to one of her posthumous novels, and that was it. Not much of it was saved. We didn't have much, and she didn't have children. And so Christina Rossetti tries to figure out how to write this biography. She goes to the British Library, she does research, she puts out a call in the newspaper, does anyone have any documentation? And finally, she just cannot get the documentation, and she says to her publisher, I despair and withdraw. No biography. What would have happened if Anne Radcliffe had gotten a biography that Austen got? So there are moments like that, turning points. We have these building of consensus, these cultural reasons, these social reasons. You can't deny the effect of movies, film adaptations on the popular fandom of Austen. I'm sorry, you can't deny that, But Mysteries of Udolpho series win. Like, we need a TV series for Mysteries of Udolpho, I'm sorry. And so those types of things make a difference. So I don't think it's always as simple as this writer's great and this one is not. I think there's a lot more going on.
I have a quick question and then a real one. So my quick one is, on that image, I don't think I knew that Love and Friendship was published solo, so I'm just curious what that book is. That's actually my favorite Austen.
Oh, really?
So it's a satire of sentimental fiction. So
Yes.
if you like Northanger Abbey, give Love and Friendship a try. I'll say it's very awesome and terrible and great.
A lot of fainting, too.
They faint on couches and
Alternately.
alternating. Anyway. So I'm curious about that book. And then my real question was, you encountered all these authors by starting with Austen and then looking backward. And that's how I encountered them too. So in some ways, when you have Austen first, it's really challenging to read these authors and not see Austen. I'm frequently put in a position where my students have never read Austen, which I find very shocking, but they don't teach Pride and Prejudice in school as often as they used to. So when I have students and they have a fresh slate for the 18th century, I often struggle with, where do you put Austen? Do you put her chronologically at the end, or do you give them the cultural touchstone at the beginning and then let them go on the same journey as you? So I was just curious, if you could prescribe a journey, what would you do?
Okay. So first, that Love and Friendship, I believe it's from 1921. This is actually the first printed publication of Love and Friendship. So Austen's Juvenilia, starting, you have the memoir in 1870. In 1871, the second edition of the memoir comes out, which by popular request includes the first publication of some of her unfinished works, the Watson, Fragment of Sanditon, etc. So you start to see her incompleted or juvenile works getting published posthumously. And then, over time, with the growing of the Austen apparatus, critical and fan apparatus, you start seeing her works that were not completed, that were often fragmentary, that were often larks that she was writing as a teenager. They start getting actual printed publications. And so when it comes to her Juvenilia, you have Love and Friendship. You actually have technically 3 volumes, are usually called the first volume, the second volume, the third. And they're coming out in the 1920s, 1930s, and I believe the last one doesn't come out until the 1940s, which means that you can buy Austen first editions for like $40 if you're looking at like getting a copy of volume the second or something. This Love and Friendship was not an expensive book. So yeah, the history of how Austen gets published is sort of unusual too, because it is connected with her rising reputation. This was not considered publishable. Her nephew would never have published this, right? So that took till the next generation and a different assessment of her as a writer for this to be considered worth putting out there. Okay, in terms of what I would do, so I think that, again, I love Austen. I want to be very clear. Austen love is what got me here. And also, I do think we have a tendency to lionize her, and I think we have a tendency to ascribe to her originality that she does not actually merit. And I think that oftentimes that comes because we're dealing with so much of those like cultural barnacles. We're bringing so much to it. Just like, I don't know if you all have read Moby Dick. Moby Dick is a very different book when you read it than what you think you know about it. A lot of classic books are like that, where their reputation and what they're like when you read them are very different. And Austen, I think, you're bringing all of that. You're already inclined to like Austen because you know that she's good. She's canonical. At least I think you give her the benefit of the doubt because you're like, oh, there's Shakespeare and Dickens and Austen. I may not like her personally, I may not be moved by this, but other people said she's good, fine. And I think that a lot of these other authors, they don't get any of that benefit of the doubt at all. And so for me, I would be inclined to start with them and let them be read on their own terms. Like read The Female Quixote and then read Northanger Abbey. because then you have the interesting dialogue, but you're letting Lennox, especially if they haven't read Austen before, they're letting Lennox be Lennox rather than Lennox whom Austen read. I don't know, though. You're the teacher. You're the expert, not me.
We've got one more question.
I'd just like to come back to collecting. My husband and I bought a new house recently, and he gave up his dining room so I could have a dedicated library for books that I've had since I was 10. Yes, thank you. And I'm 70, and to see a young woman up here talking about book collecting and being a dealer is really encouraging. And I wonder if you've seen things change, or do you feel you're coming into a different profession at this point, or what do you see as the future for
Sure.
paper that's so ephemeral and we prize the way we do?
So first, thank you for calling me young. I know it's all relative. That's very nice. I would reference back to the Honeywax Book Collecting Prize that I mentioned at the beginning of this. Through administering this prize, which is for book collectors age 30 and younger, these women are creating collections that are so creative and so engaged with the material, and specifically engaged with the objectness, with the materiality of what they're collecting. So I don't think that that is something that the young kids don't have. I really believe that that is a human urge that we have to go down these rabbit holes and to respond to the past and to be interested in investigating it from whatever niche topic we are interested in. But particularly, I think in some ways, upcoming generations have a natural advantage for this because, when I was growing up, you're not reading ebooks, and when you're talking about reading Pride and Prejudice, there wasn't for me much distinction in my mind between Pride and Prejudice, the text, and Pride and Prejudice in its many instantiations as different books and different editions, different copies of the text. Like that, it was just Pride and Prejudice. It was the book, a book. That was all the same to me. But now, when you always have to choose, even as a reader, am I going to read this as an ebook or am I going to read this as a print copy? You have foregrounded just by your very first choice, even as a reader, the materiality question. And you say, why would I want to read a print copy over an e-copy? I want to feel it in my hands. I want the weight. I want to hear the pages turn. The particular benefits of a print copy, the reasons that you might choose it, are material. And even how you remember things as opposed to when you're reading that way as opposed to an ebook. I think that when we're in this world where that choice exists for us and we can see that distinction so much more clearly and therefore understand the pros and cons more, I think that in fact it's a very natural instinct. And I would point to things like the rise of collecting vinyl. There are a lot of things that we're seeing in younger generations where they're going back, they're trying to unplug, right? We're trying to detox a little bit from our increasingly digital world. We're living so much on our screens that getting away from it, putting on a record, feels like a refuge. So I think that, in fact, the more we are living in this digital world, the more natural and comforting and satisfying and like coming home it feels to just be in your body, be in the physical space and read a physical book and think about this book as an object.
So for those of us here in Cleveland on April 22nd, 2025, there are nibbles in the back. Please help yourself to things to eat. Please go upstairs to the second floor and see our exhibit of materials related to this topic from our library's collections. And let's give Rebecca a warm round of applause. Thanks so much.